Hey, how you doing? It's Clayton here from howtodrawcomics.net and welcome to today's tutorial. In this video, we're going to be continuing on from our Boarork the Brute illustration that we started last week or the week before. And at this point, the point at which we have arrived at currently, we've got the overall draft for the illustration down onto the page. We figured out the general composition, we know where all the characters are going to be placed and how they're going to be posed. We've also got an idea as to how those characters are going to be lit, and also, on top of that, how they will be rendered. And with that rough draft down, it's time to go right in over the top with the final line art. Clean it up, make sure it's clear cut, and bring this line art illustration through to completion. We won't be tackling the whole thing in this video. We'll really only be focused on Boarork himself here. And then in a later video, what we'll do is we'll go over the top of the decapitated orcs that have come up against him and we'll tackle them. But for now, we're focused on Boarork the Brute. And as always, the very first thing that I always attend to first is the face of the character. Now, why do I do that? Why do I always outline, render, and focus on the face of a character before anything else? Well, the reason for that is because I see the face of a character as being extremely important. More important than their body, more important than their costuming, more important than anything else. And the reason for that is because the face of a character is by far one of the most expressive parts of them overall. That's how we relate with the character, how we gather some kind of understanding as to what they're feeling, their personality, and to conclude what their emotional state might be. Which is important for us because we're emotional creatures. If we look at something and we don't really feel like it has some level of emotional captivation which is being conveyed within it, then it just kind of comes across as being lifeless. It doesn't feel real. It's static. It's like a shell without a ghost inside of it. And so what I try to do as much as possible is get as much life and expression established within the face first and foremost, before anything else. And once I have done that, once I've got the face outlined, I feel like a pressure has been taken off because I've got the most important thing that matters out of everything else to me done. And now I can rest easy knowing that I've attended to that and start to move my way around the rest of the body, outlining it, making sure that it is also defined with slick, sharp, clean-looking line art, which is really the purpose of this step. We've got the draft down, right? It's rough, it's rudimentary, but it gives us a pretty solid roadmap that we can just follow, go over the top of, and arrive at an end outcome that's going to give us a fairly predictable representation of the illustration because we planned it out. We know how it's going to pan out from this point onward. And that's important to take note of. The importance of having a rough draft there ready to go, something that you can work with. The idea is down. You don't have to think about it anymore. You don't need to worry about how it'll be composed. You know exactly what you need to do and what it's going to take in order to bring it through to completion. So what am I focused on here then? If I'm not really focused on the idea itself anymore, and I don't need to be concerned with the composition, the characters, how they'll be posed, their proportions, or anything else, all of that is taken care of. So if I don't have to worry about it anymore, then what am I focused on here? Well, I'm focused on a few things, and most of them have to do with making sure the final aesthetics of the line work itself are defined with an extreme level of clarity and aesthetic appeal. Because the line weights that you're seeing me add in, you'll notice that the primary contour that I'm outlining his body with now isn't of a consistent thickness the entire way through. It actually varies from thick to thin along the trajectory of that line. And you'll also notice that here, before I fill in the shadows, I'm outlining them first. Why am I doing that? Why don't I just start laying down thick black line art? Or filling in the shadows just with big broad strokes of black. Why do I take the time to articulate their shape to such a fine degree of articulation? Well, the reason for that is because I want to give them a strong, powerful, extremely sharp contour that is going to define their silhouette with a certain level of impact. I want to make sure that it has a high degree of visual vividness to it. Because if that shape isn't clear, if it's not clean, and it doesn't describe the anatomy in an impactful way, and honestly, that can be very, very difficult to actually describe what it is you're drawing, whether it be with shadows, whether it be with the outline alone, to describe every aspect of that illustration with a certain level of impact and visual appeal. It's difficult, and what I want to try to get across to you in this video is precisely what you need to do in order to be able to incorporate that visual appeal into your own drawings. And there's a few different components to it, but the main ones are to ensure that the outline, let's go ahead and break down this entire process into 3 different stages, because the first stage really is to make sure that you've got a solid outline around each and every area of your character and the general overall illustration as a whole. The second part is placing in the shadows, making sure that the silhouette of those shadows have a strong, powerful shape that fits around the forms throughout the character, throughout the illustration, in a way that describes them, not just accurately, but with a certain level of exaggeration. That's how I'd put it. You want to try to make sure that as you drop in the shadows around every form, around the anatomy of the characters, around their clothing items, around every single thing that you're going to see shadows surround, you want to ensure that they're describing those areas with this exaggerated level of visual impact, because that impact is really what is going to make your comic book art much more memorable. That's what allows the viewer to have their attention hooked in to your illustration almost immediately, without a time delay. Their eyes just click over into it and their attention is held there, because you're not just showing them a representation of, any old thing that they might see in reality. It's not a photograph. It's this exaggerated interpretation of reality. And that level of exaggeration, for some reason, just really holds our attention. And not only that, but it also burns into our brain, into our memory, in a much deeper way. And that's why some of the most impactful comic book art is the most stylized. So, for example, Joe Mad's work, you might be familiar with it. Jim Lee's work. If you look at the work of these comic book artists, you'll notice that the key contours that surround every single aspect of their illustrations, the shadows that they place in, the rendering that they crosshatch, it's all placed in such a way that it exaggerates the visual impact of their drawings, and it pushes it to the hilt of visual vividness in doing so. And that's what you want to incorporate into your own work. You don't want the audience to be passive. You want them to be completely and 100% engaged in the work that you show them, because that's the whole point in doing this in the first place, is to create a representation of your idea that's clearly communicated to the audience, but also makes them feel good when they look at it, because it hooks them in. And the fact that they're hooked in, the fact that you've managed to capture their attention, to click and switch off from the outside world around them, to become infused with the idea that you're presenting to them, that's a very powerful thing to be able to do. And the way in which it's done is once more through those 3 individual components that you're going to use in order to ensure the line art of every single comic book illustration you create is as impactful and vivid as it possibly can be. Line weights, shadows, and crosshatches. And you'll see me incorporate each and every single one of those ingredients into the pencils of Boarork the Brute here. So usually I will focus on making sure that the contours, the outline of my drawing has been defined first and foremost, oftentimes before I attend to the shadows. And then finally, I'll drop in the rendering and any last minute details. I like to think of them as the cherries on top, the decorative aspects of the illustration at the end. But it's always the outline first. And here I've made a little bit of an exception because, as you can see, I've also incorporated some shadows in and around his body there, his upper torso. And one of the reasons that I skipped ahead there and did that was because I just wanted to see how those shadows would look, because I wasn't totally and 100% sure. Yes, they were there in the draft, but for me, I was really, really curious and worried, quite frankly, as to whether or not I had placed them in the right areas and whether those forms, the anatomy that they're surrounding, would read correctly. And luckily they did, and I was satisfied with that. But sometimes my worry, my concern for the illustration and how certain parts of it will ultimately turn out cause me to focus on and make sure that they're worked out, that they have been addressed as soon as possible. It's kind of like the same reason I started out by giving the head and its final pencils, is because I was worried about how it would turn out. I wanted to make sure that if there was one area of this illustration that looked the best, looked as good as it could, that it was going to be the head, because I knew that the head would be the first impression of the viewer, because that's exactly where their eyes are going to lock onto first, is the face of the character, so that they can relate with it. So that's why I attended to it first, and every other part of the illustration that I'm not feeling 100% confident with, usually I'll end up drawing my attention to it and trying to make sure that I've ironed out any perceived wrinkles that I think could potentially pop up before they do. So now I'm outlining the orcs' heads, and as I said, the outline of anything that I'm drawing is usually the first step in the final penciling phase of the illustration. And what I'm focused on during that portion of the penciling stage is making sure that that outline and the contours that make it up are weighted. And what I mean by that is that there's a certain level of variation in terms of thickness along their trajectory. The last thing I want in the outline of my drawing is a consistent thickness, because that's going to, one, flatten out the image in a very unappealing way. It's going to look static. There won't be any life to it, and it'll cause the illustration to just look visually unappealing. It won't look, it'll be unimpactful. We were talking about how important it is to make sure that your illustrations are impactful as possible. Well, if your line weights aren't placed in the correct way, or if your drawing lacks line weights altogether, then that impact just isn't going to be there. They are used precisely to increase the level of visual appeal as much as possible. And you'll always see the difference between an illustration that uses line weights and makes good use of them and one that doesn't. And the reason as to why line weights can add such a high degree of vividness to your work and really make it stand out against the rest in a significant way is because they can suggest things like depth, lighting direction, and emphasis on key areas of focus throughout the illustration that you want people to pay attention to. And how do we do that? How do we make sure that those purposes, again, the level of depth, the lighting direction, and the emphasis, how do we make sure and use line weights to get those things coming across within our work as vividly as possible? Well, the way that I like to go about it, let's start with lighting, for example, is if I'm outlining a form, I'll always try to make sure that the side of the form, which is turning away from the light and falling into shadow, has a much thicker outline around it than the side of the form which is being hit by the light directly. In that case, on the light side of the form, I'll try to keep the outline light and fine. And by doing that, just through the outline alone, with the contours themselves, I'm able to indicate that there is some lighting scheme within the scene, and that's without having placed in any shadows or rendering to indicate it. So, line weights are incredibly powerful for just being able to represent some level of lighting within your illustration. Now, on top of that, they can also be used to create a sense of depth within your art. And the way in which they do that is, let's say, for example, you've got 3 bowls, and one of those bowls are sitting further forward than the other 2 bowls, which are sitting further back. Now, in order to make it look as though that forefront ball is really popping out at us, what we can do is we can give it a much thicker outline than those sitting at the back. Now, this can also apply to a single form as well. Say, for example, we've got a cylinder, and the cylinder is popping forward toward us. So the bottom of the cylinder is sitting closest to us, while the top of the cylinder is being pulled back. It's receding further back within the perspective that we've got it represented in. Well, the side of the sphere, which is sitting closest to us, is going to have a thicker outline around it, while the top of it, which is receding away from us, which is being pulled back, is going to have a thinner outline. And again, that sense of perspective, that depth is going to be suggested just through the contours, the line weights alone. And that's incredible. So now we've got depth, we've got lighting, which is now being indicated just through the outline of the forms alone. No shading or rendering required at this point, just the outline. So it's incredibly powerful, especially when coupled with shadows and rendering, because then all of a sudden you're enhancing the level of depth and three-dimensionality within your artwork even more. You're taking it to that next level. Now finally, you can emphasize various portions of your illustration in order to create somewhat of a visual hierarchy using line weights. So let's say, for example, on this illustration, we really wanted to draw a lot of attention to Boarork's sword. Well, in order to do that, just as we were talking about with our ball example, what we can do is we can give the sword itself a much thicker outline. And because of that thickened outline, our eyes are going to click and lock onto that portion of the illustration first, just because there's more contrast there. And that's what outlining something with a thick, bold outline does, is it just draws our attention to it. It's literally like if you're writing up an article in a Word document and you embolden the title, or you embolden a piece of text within one of the paragraphs inside that article. Your attention is going to lock onto that specific word that's been emboldened. And you're doing the exact same thing here with the areas of your illustration that you lay a thicker outline around. And so what you can do with this nifty little technique, just using line weights again, is that you can lead the viewer's eye throughout the illustration, and you can have them pay attention to the specific things that you want them to pay attention to that's really going to enhance the narrative, the visual cues they need to know about first and foremost. Now, when it comes to shadows, and again, you can see here that I've taken the time to go around the outside edge of those shadows and make sure they're defined with a strong, vivid shape before filling them in. That helps me to fill them in while maintaining their silhouette and making sure that it's as vivid as possible. And by doing that, we're enhancing the impact that they're providing for the drawing. With strong shape, especially strong shapes like these shadows that are used to describe the anatomy and the forms that they're surrounding, we're able to increase that level of visual impact once more. And that's what this entire penciling stage is all about, is making sure that we are injecting as much visual impact into our illustration as possible. Because that's what's really going to draw in the attention of your audience first and foremost. That's what's going to get them to pay attention to what it is you're showing them. It will make it more interesting to look at, and most importantly, it'll inject life into your art. It'll make it look as though it has a soul to it, which at the end of the day, if you can have your illustrations move on the page just through the way in which you've articulated them, as if you could hit the play button and this entire scene would play out, that's really when you've nailed the art of comic book illustration, especially when you're talking about paneled sequentials. You want to get that idea across that this is a snapshot, a mere snapshot in an entire scenario that is unfolding. And the actors that you're using here to show that situation and the idea that you're conveying within your work need to be defined and illustrated in a way that, again, makes them not look like stone statues, but rather real, living people or creatures, as is the case with our orcs. And if you can do that in a convincing way, it's going to suspend the disbelief of your audience, and it's going to draw them further into the world, the scenario, and the characters that are being presented to them. And they're going to feel much more involved in your work as a result. They're going to feel as though they're a part of it. Okay, so now we're working on the bottom portion of Boarork the Brute here, adding in those shadows. You can see how clean cut this particular style is. And it is detailed, of course. It's not as clean cut as some of the styles that are out there, but I actually created this illustration, and I mentioned this in the previous video where we were working on Boarork the Brute. I'll post a link to that in the description below this video, by the way. But I made it a while ago now, and back when I made it, I was really influenced by David Finch, and you can probably tell that by the way in which I'm adding in these crosshatches now. It's his typical crosshatching style that I'm using in this example, and you can see, by the way, as I add these crosshatches in, how I'm applying line weights to them as I stroke them in and run them around the form of his bicep there. And you'll see that the bottom portion of each one of those hatches has a greater amount of thickness than the top of them as they're drawn out of the shadow, and the thickness of their contour forms into this apex point. It's like a pinpoint right at the top there. And so that thick to thin transition along the trajectory of those little tiny hatches as they're drawn out of the shadows creates this subtle blend, or the appearance of a blend, between the shadows, the thick black shadows, and the highlights. And that's really what we're trying to do here with these crosshatches. That's ultimately the purpose of them, is to create a tonal transition between the pure blacks and the pure whites, which further describes the surface of the form that we're dealing with. And you can see how I'm going throughout his entire body here, and I'm trying my best to describe each and every one of his major muscle groups with as much clarity as I can. And the way in which I'm doing that is I'm making sure that as I pull these hatches out around the form, and this is a really great example of how I like to approach hatching. As I pull them out around the form, you'll notice that they're not pulled out in a straight line. They're actually following a curve, and that curve is consistent with the surface of the form that they're being placed upon. So it's actually curving around those muscles. Every hatch, as it's pulled out across the biceps, across the pecs, it's pulled out in a way that describes the form, but also how the form is lit. So it's describing the lighting as well. And the blending, the tonal transition, again, between the shadows and the highlights. So rendering has a multitude of purposes, just like line weights do. You know, the line weights, as I said before, they help to describe the lighting and the depth and the emphasis of various aspects of the illustration, but rendering helps you to also describe the form, the surface of the form that you're dealing with, and also adds to the description of the lighting conditions. And to place them in accurately, of course, I'm always keeping in the back of my mind an understanding of where the major light source is in the scene, in order to ensure that as I pull those crosshatches out from the shadows toward the light, that they're being pulled out in the correct direction. Again, describing the form as I do by having them curve around it. And that is key to making sure that these crosshatches look as though they're being placed incorrectly. Now, the fact that they help to describe the lighting and the nature of the lighting within these forms, as well as the surface of the forms themselves, it kind of goes hand in hand, those two aspects, when you really think about it, because a form doesn't really have any form without lighting and without shadows. And so the crosshatches really enhance those aspects, and as a result, introduce that additional level of depth and dimension to the illustration. And you could go with any kind of style you want. There's a lot of styles out there that don't use crosshatches whatsoever. They don't have any additional details. They don't have shadows. They only have the outline alone. Again, talking about Joe Mad's artwork, for example. And there's a lot of other examples out there as well. Now, I don't know what those examples are because I'm a huge fan of super detailed comic book art. As I said, I was a fan and still am a fan of David Finch's work and have been for a long time. And the reason for that is because his approach to cross-hatching just made a lot of sense to me. And he described it in very much the same way that I've just described it to you. You know, these cross-hatches, as they're pulled out from the shadows, wrap around the form. Now, that's around the form. Now, I've also got hatches running along the form in the opposite direction, and a 90-degree direction, in fact. So those crosshatches are overlapping against one another. And the reason that I will add in not just hatches, but crosshatches as well, is because what I'm always trying to do is increase the level of contrast and thus the level of depth within the forms of my illustrations and my characters. And that's what those crosshatches allow me to do. They allow me to push the depth and also increase the perceived value that the crosshatches are coming together to create. And it gives me a wider variety of tone as a result. So I'm able to, in the darkest areas of a form, say for example around the bottom of Boarork's leg here, I'm able to increase the number of crosshatches, their thickness, and their spacing. I will tend to, the darker the area is, I'll make those crosshatches and the distance between them smaller and smaller so that I can give the tone they're creating a lower level of value, a more intense darkness to them. And as the forms transition into the light, into the lightest areas, what I'll do instead is I'll lay off of the crosshatches a little bit. I'll make them less intense, less thick, and I'll try to increase their subtlety to make it look as though the hierarchy of light is falling off across the form in an accurate manner. And so cross-hatching really, has a lot of gears to it, you could think of it as. There's a lot of things that you can do with cross-hatches to control the tone that they're creating, the amount of blend, the softness of that blend, the sharpness of that blend, between the shadows and the highlights. And the way in which I like to control the rendering is through the spacing of the hatches and their thickness, first and foremost. The thicker a crosshatch is, the darker it's going to appear, especially when it's placed very close to its neighbor. So when you've got a ton of crosshatches that are packed in super tight, they're sitting next to one another very, very closely, that's going to increase the darkness of the tone that they're coming together to compose. Now, when you combine that with cross-hatching, and you lay in another layer of hatches over the top of those already tightly packed hatches, what you'll get is an even darker tone. Now, in contrast to that, when it comes to creating lighter tones, lighter values, what you'll tend to want to do is the opposite. You'll want to widen the spread and the distance between each one of those individual hatches. And you'll probably want to make sure that they're placed in with a less heavy line, that the line is finer, more subtle. And you'll probably want to lay off the hatches as well if you want to keep that tone light. Now, it depends as to where you're placing these hatches, around which area of the form, how much of that form is in darkness, how much of it is lit, and you'll use those considerations to figure out how you should be placing these crosshatches and where they should be placed in order to describe the forms accurately under the given lighting condition. But that's totally up to you, because your illustrations are going to be at the whim of your decided lighting setup. So light them however you want. Just remember that the way in which you show the way they're lit is going to come down to your understanding of where the light source is, what the forms are that you're dealing with, and their surface characteristics. And then ultimately how you convey all of that through your hatching and through the shadows, through the line weights. Again, the final pencils of your illustrations are going to be made up of those primary three components: pencils, shadows, and rendering. Now, as I was saying before, David Finch, he was probably my first and longest running inspiration, the guy who influenced my style the most out of almost anybody. And I think that that's obvious here. You can certainly see it within my work. But it doesn't do any of us that much good to base our style purely on just one artist, because otherwise what ends up happening is we become a clone. And nobody wants a clone, because oftentimes we're not going to be able to do any better than that artist, and even if we do surpass their level of perceived expertise that we have of them, our art will end up looking different, so it won't be really their style anymore. What you want to do to avoid becoming a clone is you want to try to combine one artist's style with another artist's style. And for me, what I did was I took inspirations from everywhere. And although I was fairly heavily influenced by David Finch at the point at which I made this illustration, I also had other inspirations, such as Mark Silvestri, for example, Jim Lee. I loved the simplicity of his style and its level of complexity at certain times as well, yet at the same time, regardless of its complexity or simplicity, it still looked like his style. And I wanted, for example, that in my own work. I wanted the freedom to be able to dial the level of complexity and simplicity within my work in a way that still made it appear as though it was a consistent style. I loved the level of intricacy in Mark Silvestri's work, the super fine, subtle details that gave his illustrations that additional level of life to them. That sense of place, that sense of drama, it made the visuals that much more interesting to look at. And then David Finch, I loved his cinematic quality that he introduced into his artwork with the heavy shadows, the heavy rendering. It made his work that much more dramatic. And I knew the characteristics that each of these artists brought to their work, and I wanted to combine them as best I could. Later on, I found the work of J. Scott Campbell to be very inspirational as well. And I loved all of these artists, and I did my best to learn as much as I could from them and combine it, compile everything that I've learned into my own style. And that's really what I'd like you to take away from today's demonstration, is that although I'm sharing the techniques with you here in this video that I'm demonstrating in front of you, I want you to use them in your own way. You might not use everything that I'm showing you here, but do your best to find the place in which the various lessons that I'm sharing with you in this video and all the others that I've uploaded here to the channel, do your best to incorporate them in your own way. Combine them with all your influence, with all your inspirations. And hopefully you'll be able to compile a style that is uniquely you, because that's what makes a style unique. When you combine all your inspirations into one place to create something new, you put them in a blender and you come out with something which has never been seen before, something which is still relatable, something which is still appealing, that other people can look at and they're reminded of. For example, when people look at my work, there is a certain level of character to it that is reminiscent of David Finch, of Mark Silvestri, of Jim Lee, of Michael Turner, of J. Scott Campbell, of all those people who have inspired me. And they can't quite put their finger on it as to why that same vibe, that same spirit is coming through in my work. But it still looks unique to me. And I think that after some time, you do make your work your own. But you've got to start from somewhere. You can't just start out with a style. All of these artists I've mentioned, they had their own inspirations, believe me. Well, that just about wraps up today's demonstration. I hope that you got a ton of value out of it, that you learned a lot, and that a lot of the techniques and methods that I've demonstrated and explained throughout this video, you'll put to good use. It's been an absolute pleasure, as always. If you'd like more comic art tips, tricks, and tutorials, be sure to visit www.howtodrawcomics.net. Over on the site, we have a ton of written tutorials, video tutorials. We've also got a podcast. And when you're ready to delve deeper into the art of comic book illustration, be sure to check out our course selection by the likes of myself, Robert Marzullo, and Ed Foychuk. Until next time, keep on creating, keep on practicing, and I'll see you in the next video.